Hello and welcome. My name is John Strand with the SANS Institute. Today we're going to be talking about the Target breach. This breach is incredibly important as a case study to see the mistakes that were made by Target. Not necessarily to say that Target was wrong and they were incompetent or there was massive mistakes that they were made. There were in fact massive mistakes. However, what we see in Target is actually being replayed again and again and again in multiple corporations around the world. So let's talk about how this attack played out. We will also discuss what are some of the recommendations that all of us can give to other organizations to prevent being a victim like Target. One of the interesting aspects of the Target breach was that Target initially was not the main target of the attackers. Rather, it appears the attackers were targeting Physio-Mechanical Services, who did HVAC systems. It appears this organization had direct VPN access into Target for doing payments and billing with Target as an organization. It appears that they were spearphished and attacked roughly around September of 2013, and the attackers gained access to this organization. Now, it took the attackers a little bit of time to identify what initially they had access to, not just this one company, but what did this company actually have access to outside of themselves? Because in September of 2013, there was the initial attack against the HVAC vendor. We look at September, October, the attackers started harvesting credentials from that organization. Now, this is important. They were using a backdoor called Citadel, which is a well-known backdoor that has the capability of stealing passwords. One of the mistakes that you can make when looking at this attack is look at the malware that was used in this attack and think it's simply an issue of writing better signatures to detect the malware that was deployed in Target and was deployed in the HVAC vendor. That isn't true. Many of these malware specimens can easily be modified to bypass traditional signature-based detection mechanisms. In fact, you can modify many of these different tools to even bypass some advanced endpoint security products as well. So I'd encourage you, when you're looking at this particular case, in fact, any of the cases, don't try to boil it down to, we need to detect the malware that was used. We should be focusing on the techniques that are used, because if we learn how the techniques were implemented, we can implement effective defenses to stop those techniques. So yes, the attackers used a backdoor that was actually based off of Zeus, believe it or not. It was an evolution and a modification of that code to actually steal passwords. Now, it's interesting because there's a wide variety of tools that you can use today to do pretty much the exact same thing. One of the tools that we use in many of our assessments is a tool called Mimikatz. Mimikatz has the ability to dump password hashes from local Windows computer systems, but it also has the ability to dump the clear text passwords from these systems as well. Moving forward in the timeline, the next date that we have is November. With this, the attackers first make their movement into Target, accessing the VPN that was used by the HVAC vendor. It appears this VPN was used for the HVAC vendor to actually get paid from Target. This is very, very, very common in extremely large organizations. They have a lot in accounts payable, a lot in accounts receivable, many, many organizations that they do business with. So they tend to use portals to handle all their accounts payable and all their accounts receivable. In fact, my company, to get paid for many of these large organizations, has to use many of the exact same suppliers. And believe it or not, the VPN was actually a security feature. The goal was to have vendors VPN in, not do a direct access to a website, but VPN in and then access the portal. Unfortunately, once the attackers were able to VPN in to Target, and ideally, the HVAC vendor would access just the payment portals. However, the VPN also had access to a large amount of the other parts of the Target network. This is one of the reoccurring themes that you're going to see in this particular incident, is that there was not proper segmentation in the Target network to stop the attackers from moving laterally to other additional resources. So let's move forward again. 15th to the 26th, the attackers move laterally throughout the network. And there are alerts that are generated. There's so much to talk about this particular phase of the attack. One, there are lots of tools that allow you to do this. A number of the tools that we use regularly in our security assessments are tools like Death Star and PowerShell Empire. that'll automatically enumerate from the access we have to a single workstation or a single system to then access additional resources throughout the network. And it'll automate these resources and these services automatically. Once again, we should never get caught up on a specific tool, but look at the technique. The capability of mounting and accessing additional resources and additional shares is something that is built into every single Windows computer system that is in many environments today. What the attackers do and what pen testers do is utilize these tools and scripts to automatically enumerate this access so we can quickly elevate our privileges and gain access to additional resources that possibly could give us domain administrator, possibly could get us access to healthcare information, possibly could get us access to PCI information. And that's what we had here. The attackers were able to move laterally to gain access to credit card information. They were able to dump SQL databases from additional computer systems as well. So we see that movement. However, that movement did generate alerts. If you actually read articles and you see videos about what happened to Target, there are many security professionals and pundits that say that Target was negligent. They were getting alerts from FireEye. They were getting alerts from Symantec. Why didn't they act? Well, there's a couple of ways to look at this. One way to look at this is to assume that everyone at Target was incompetent. They had security teams in Minnesota, they had security teams in India, and maybe they didn't share information. Maybe people weren't reviewing the information from these alerts. However, working very closely with many of these organizations over the years, that's not the whole story. While many organizations will have a lot of technology and a lot of alerting and a lot of telemetry for these attacks, the white noise is generated from a large number of these different tools, constantly generating false positives, constantly generating maybe legitimate attack alerts, can become overwhelming for security operations centers to try to keep up. You see, it's not just an issue of having a magical tool like FireEye. It is not a matter of just simply having an endpoint security product that'll stop all attacks. You need to have trained personnel to receive those alerts, process those alerts, and then act on those alerts adequately. In this situation, another thing that you may hear and read is FireEye was set up to not block the attacks. Many security tools have the built-in capability to automatically block any malware or any attack that they actually see. And this sounds fantastic in theory. In reality, the way these tools are configured is with a high level of paranoia that these tools may block legitimate traffic. They may interrupt legitimate business operations. And just so you know, it is very common for security tools to actually interrupt business operations. So it is very, very, very common for these tools to be configured to alert and not block the attacks. So don't ever assume because somebody was compromised and the tool wasn't configured to automatically stop the attacks that they were incompetent or they didn't know what they were doing. They were just dealing with the business realities of trying to keep the business going while trying to secure the organization as well. Many times with limited staff or staff that isn't trained properly to handle this level of alerts or even use these tools. So please don't look at Target and say that they were the exception and that they were incompetent. Because trust me, many organizations are dealing with the exact same limitations as what we see in this particular Target breach. If we move forward to November 27th, please note the date. If we're looking at the date time frame, that is right after Thanksgiving. As you know, Black Friday is the 26th. And if we have the actual point of sale malware is starting to gather data literally in the busiest time of the year, if you're working at an organization like Target during this time, there's a whole bunch of interesting things that happen from a security perspective. Number one, the amount of traffic that is generated to all of these security appliances, these alerts, and the team having to go through them grows at a very dramatic rate because there's a lot more traffic that's being generated. Also, staffs start to get a little bit burnt out during these holiday seasons, and it can be very, very hard to have somebody who's fresh and able to handle these alerts whenever they've been working long hours. Finally, many organizations, especially very large retailers, get very, very paranoid about any alerts, any modifications, any changes to the production network. If you're a security representative and you interrupt production during the absolute busiest part of the year, it is without question going to mean the end of your job. And I believe firmly that the attackers knew exactly what they were doing for two reasons. One, during this time frame, the Black Friday huge sales time frame, the amount of credit cards that they're able to harvest goes up by orders of magnitude. Also, the ability for security teams to detect the attack is reduced. So for an attacker, this is an absolute dream. You can harvest more data, and the team that should be detecting you is overworked, and they're probably have their hands tied as far as what it is they're allowed to do in the production network during this time frame. Move forward again. 30th of November. The attackers installed data exfiltration mechanism, and yes, more alerts are triggered. Once again, it is really easy to look at this and say, well, at this point, Target should have detected something. Once again, many of these systems and these users of these systems, these security systems, are overwhelmed with the amount of alerts that are being generated in many of these scenarios. It is very common for endpoint security to generate a tremendous number of alerts, and if an alert is triggered and it's not an actual attack, it's a false positive, and the team has to go through and wade through those false positives. So this is a very trying time for many of these security teams. Move forward again, December 2nd. The attackers start exfiltrating data. Now it's interesting because the attackers actually exfiltrated data and they dropped it in servers in Brazil and in Miami, and then it was staged and then eventually was moved to Russia. We'll talk about how they detected that a little bit later. But the point is, we're seeing the data being pulled off of the network to multiple staging servers that are intermediary servers. Now, what can we learn from this? Attackers that are smart, and these attackers were smart, they don't pull the data directly to their home computer systems. They don't pull it directly to the organized crime organization that they're working through. Many times, they will find third-party intermediary servers to store this data because they don't want to have a direct connection from the victim's network back to the systems that they maintain and that they work with. December 12th, United States Department of Justice notifies Target of suspicious credit card transactions. Over the years, there's been a number of data breach reports that have came out from organizations like Verizon and Mandiant. And one of the things that becomes very clear with these data breach reports is the vast majority of organizations find out that they were breached, not from some amazing technology, but they find out that they were breached from external third parties. Could be a customer, could be the United States government, could be law enforcement, could be a credit card agency. This is an unfortunate truth to many of these large-scale breaches that we see. Many of the organizations, even with the best of intentions and the best technologies implemented, are still being notified by external third parties. And we are seeing that quite often in the incidents that we work as well. Next, we move to the 15th of December. Target confirmed the breach, and they removed most of the malware. Some people argue and they say that the time frame between the 12th and the 15th is too long. I hesitate to get too worked up about the timeline it takes for organizations to notify customers, to notify employees, to notify business partners of breaches. There's a number of reasons why I hesitate to lay too much blame at these organizations' feet. When you're working an incident, there is something very similar to a fog of war. You do not have perfect information. And as an organization that's working through an incident, you do not want to go about releasing information to the public, releasing information to business partners that may be incorrect. So many of these organizations will wait before until they have a very clear picture of how the attack actually happened, what is the full impact of the attack, before they start notifying organizations. Now, also, to be honest, there are organizations that wait far too long, and they may wait for a certain event to try to release to the public the details of the attack, to try to get it buried, maybe a hurricane or something, to try to release at the same time so most people wouldn't actually see the news story. Both of these things happen, but in this situation, I'm firmly convinced that Target was just waiting until they got better control of the situation and more information about the attack before they actually went public and started releasing that data with everybody. Finally, 18th of December. Brian Krebs reports on this breach publicly. So if we're looking at it, we have the 12th is when Target first initially found out about the attack from the Department of Justice. And then the 18th is whenever it was actually blogged about publicly from Brian Krebs. In the grand scheme of things, that's not that long of a time frame between those two. And once again, unfortunately, many of these organizations find out about these breaches far too late, and the damage has in fact already been done. So let's talk a little bit about lateral movement. We discussed it before a little bit earlier. There's a wide variety of tools that are available for an attacker to take access to a standalone workstation and then pivot around. And some of the tools that they can use are not even hacker tools. Some of these tools are actually tools that are written by Microsoft themselves. Now, just to be honest, Microsoft isn't writing hacker tools, but they're writing tools for remote systems administration, tools like PSExec. There are many attacker tools that will take advantage of PSExec or the functionality used by PSExec to move laterally. And this affords the attacker a number of benefits. One of the biggest benefits for an attacker is they're using built-in protocols and built-in tools to move laterally. This will reduce the ability for the attacker to be detected by many security products unless they're actually tuned properly as well. Also, Active Directory, just by itself in Windows environments, gives an organization the ability to have user controls. So users can log into one workstation with their account, they can log into another workstation with their account, and security policies will follow with them. It's a great tool for administering your environment. It's also a great tool for attackers, because if I take access and take control to one workstation, it is very, very easy for me to leverage the credentials that I have to then pivot and access multiple additional resources as the user account that I'm currently logged into. Also downloaded 70 million records from Microsoft SQL Server databases. It is also easy using tools like PowerUp SQL to easily identify these servers in Active Directory, so then the attacker gets a roadmap of where these sensitive servers are so they can access them directly as well. So with that lateral movement, we see this theme in Target. And I want you to understand, once again, Target is not the exception. They are the rule. We do over 350 assessments a year. And the techniques that are used in Target, we reuse again and again and again in our assessments. And the vast majority of organizations, I would say 98 to 90% of the organizations that we encounter have the exact same type of lateral movement vulnerabilities that we saw in the Target breach. And this breach happened years ago, and we're still seeing the exact same problems today in many organizations. Let's talk about malware for a few moments. The malware that was actually installed on the point of sale systems is called Black POS, or the Kartosha malware. That is interesting because you can download this malware easily from a variety of different websites. Now, once again, I wouldn't look at this malware and say, Target should be able to detect that malware, and I wouldn't say, well, Symantec should write a signature for that malware. It is very, very easy for attackers to take existing malware and modify it in very slight and subtle ways and bypass many of the endpoint security products that are out there today. So this is not an issue about writing better tools to detect malware. It really becomes an issue for us to be able to detect how that malware actually functions. How does it hook into memory? How does it exfiltrate the data that it scrapes out of memory to command and control servers online? So we're seeing these themes play out again and again and again. And one of my major concerns is I don't want organizations to boil it down to Target was incompetent. I don't want people to boil it down to we need to develop better malware detection and endpoint security products, because that would be the wrong lesson to learn from the Target breach. Instead, we need to change the way that we look at computer security to kind of look at it as a systematic approach. We have some frameworks to help with this. One of the frameworks that we have is the cyber kill chain that was created by Lockheed Martin. What Lockheed Martin basically did is they identified the paths that an attacker would take to successfully compromise an organization, maintain access to an organization, and exfiltrate data out of that organization. And the theory is, and it's a very good one, we need to develop defenses for each one of the phases of attack that an attacker would actually use. So we have reconnaissance, weaponization, delivery, exploitation, installation, command and control, and then actually acting on the objectives. In this situation, exfiltrating a tremendous amount of credit card data from point of sale systems. So if we take the attack and we overlay the cyber kill chain we can now get a better view of how we can start implementing security controls to better defend against the attack. For example, if we look at reconnaissance, in this situation, the attackers used reconnaissance to identify this HVAC vendor and the credentials that were valid for the target domain. For weaponization, we saw a customization of the black point of sale malware. This is where you modify the malware in order to bypass existing security controls that exist. Gain VPN access to the target environment and upload the malware. We see the exploitation and post-exploitation lateral movement across that organization to gain access to the point of sale terminals as well. Initial testing and then deployment of the black point of sale malware to exfiltrate the credit cards out of that environment. And then of course the command and control servers to Brazil, to Miami, and then also eventually getting the command and control to dump the data to Russia. And the objectives are achieved. The objective is gaining access to that credit card data. So what actually failed here? Well, there was a number of things that failed. And once again, we shouldn't look at Target as the exception. These failures are failures that we see replicated again and again and again in organizations. Why? Well, if we're looking at how much security has evolved over the past few years, it is this dramatic explosion in the attack tactics, the techniques, and the evasion capabilities available to attackers. And many of these techniques have outpaced and outstripped the defensive capabilities that many organizations have started to implement. So, no application whitelisting. Application whitelisting is a tremendously effective technique that identifies what programs should be running on your computer and not just looking for bad programs. See, if you're using blacklist technologies, all the attacker has to do to bypass that is simply not be on the blacklist. With application whitelisting, while it's possible to bypass application whitelisting, it is far more difficult to the adversary. More importantly, the adversary may make mistakes in the process. Insufficient network segmentation. One of the things I'm telling all of the organizations that I work with is simply, I don't care what security product or architecture you're implementing. If you haven't implemented host-based firewalls and internal segmentation in your network, stop whatever you're doing and start segmenting your network. There are very few defensive tactics and techniques that you can implement that will be as effective as stopping attackers, pen testers, hackers, than simple segmentation and enabling your host-based firewall. And what's even more frightening, this isn't all that hard. Organizations can actually implement this, but the problem is this is not something that traditionally has been implemented in most organizations. It's not part of a traditional security architecture. Traditional security architectures are edge firewalls and edge DMZs to stop the attackers and antivirus, and that's where many organizations stop. But if we're looking at trying to stop the next generation of attackers, or even the current generation of attackers and the techniques that they have, we need to start implementing proper segmentation. Credentials. Unfortunately, many of the credentials that were compromised in the target breach appear to be really easy to guess passwords and easy to crack passwords. When we're talking about credentials, we need to use long passwords as much as we possibly can. Further, we shouldn't be reusing those passwords again and again for a variety of different services and accounts that exist. Because if we're reusing passwords, it becomes very easy for the attacker to leverage those credentials, and then once again, it greatly aids their lateral movement capabilities. Also, no follow-up and detection. Right now, if you look at information security, there is a tremendous need for more security professionals. We just do not have enough people to monitor and detect and react to all the different breaches that are happening. And organizations are trying very hard to staff and ramp up to be able to detect and stop attacks like these. But that takes time. It takes time to bring someone in. It takes time to train someone effectively to detect and stop these attacks. And right now, in the United States in particular, we are very much behind in the amount of staffing and personnel that we have to stop these cyber attacks. There are many organizations that have multiple job positions that they just cannot fill because they cannot find highly qualified and trained personnel. So it would be easy if an organization got compromised to say, why didn't they hire more people? The fact is, we just do not have enough people to staff all the security positions that we need to fill today. Additional breach factors, if we look at credentials, network segmentation, and alerting, with credential management can be very, very difficult. To go through and audit all of the passwords within an organization, to implement different randomized passwords across all of the different systems can be hard. But some vendors, like Microsoft, are trying their best to give us better products and tools to enable us to do local administrator password randomization. Microsoft has a tool called Labs that allows you to do that type of password randomization for local accounts. That helps. For network segmentation, there are a lot of free tools that are available that will allow you to do network segmentation. But here's the problem. With organizations like Target, with organizations like almost any large financial institutions, you're not just fighting against trying to implement technologies to try and segment your network, you're also trying to fight against legacy network architecture. Many of these organizations have been around for 2 decades, even longer, and they're carrying around the burden of those legacy technologies, those legacy network architectures, and simply trying to drop in proper segmentation can be extremely difficult because in many situations, it requires a complete re-architecture of the entire organization. With alerting, once again, any type of product you implement, security product like a firewall, IDS system, IPS system, FireEye, antivirus, it always requires somebody to sit down and tune that product so it works with their specific organization. That tuning can take time. That tuning always requires expertise and personnel to implement that tuning. And once again, unfortunately, many organizations just don't have the staff or the trained expertise to actually tune those things properly. As I mentioned, with the cyber kill chain, we are beginning to have some frameworks that can help us implement proper defenses. One of the biggest frameworks that came out in the past few years is the MITRE ATT&CK matrix, specifically the technique matrix. And this can very cleanly be tied over to cyber kill chain. What's beautiful about this matrix is they're taking a lot of the techniques that are being used by a lot of advanced adversaries, and they're cross-mapping and they're identifying consistencies and repeating tools and techniques that are being used again and again and again. Really, a way to think of it is imagine that a hacker has a big old box of Legos, and they have Legos for initial access, they have Legos for execution, they have Legos for persistence. And how the attacker will assemble those Legos is really unique to that specific attacker. But they're using many of the exact same Legos again and again and again. We can work with organizations, and you can work with organizations, and have them start implementing the MITRE ATT&CK technique matrix and go to it and look at the different techniques that are being used. And you can ask organizations, can you detect these individual techniques for persistence? Can you detect these individual techniques for lateral movement? Then we can start having really great conversations about what types of technologies and architectural changes can we effectively implement to stop these different techniques. It is almost impossible to predict all the different types of combinations of these techniques that an adversary may use, but it is possible for us to detect wide swaths of these techniques in the matrix. And what's beautiful is you don't even have to have 100% coverage. Many organizations will never be able to detect and stop every single one of these techniques. However, if they can detect and stop and alert on a large number of these techniques, if they miss one, when an attacker tries to use another technique or move laterally to another resource, then we can detect them. Finally, in the security industry, we have frameworks. We have sample attack techniques that organizations can use and they can test in their organization. We finally have a capability and a framework to look at adversary tactics, attacker tactics, hacker tactics, pen tester tactics, and we can start implementing security architecture and technology to protect. So what are some lessons learned from this? Well, Target did implement a large number of security controls, and I know a number of the people that worked at Target and currently work at Target, and they are working very, very diligently and hard to try to close the loopholes, to try to close the gaps that existed in the security architecture for this particular breach. Once again, this isn't something you just snap your fingers and all of a sudden security exists. In many scenarios, it requires re-architecting the entire network, starting from the ground up in Active Directory and auditing and assessing everything. And it also requires a tremendous amount of self-reflection and self-assessment. And in organizations like Target and other organizations, they're constantly working with red teams, external penetration testing, and doing purple teams to constantly improve the defenses of their organizations. Also, for many of you, you're just getting started in computer security and just getting involved in understanding how security works. Another lesson that we can learn from this breach is that Target and the organizational attack that basically almost ruined this entire organization is something that now can be stopped. But it takes a tremendous amount of resources to make it effective, or to make a defense effective to stop the attackers that they are going up against. Because once again, these attackers are evolving in some situations much faster than the defenses that we actually implement. So we have a few questions for you. First, how did the attackers first gain entry into the target network? Just take a couple of seconds, maybe write it down. Was it through a direct attack? Did they brute force passwords? No. In this situation, Target was compromised via VPN for a third-party HVAC vendor. Once again, a mistake of another organization led to a direct compromise and breach of Target. Another thing that we can learn from this is sometimes you can do the absolute best you can at computer security, and all it takes is some vendor to mess up and get compromised, and now you're breached as well. Question 2. What software did the attackers run to gather credit card information? You remember the name? The malware was a point-of-sale malware. It was called Black POS. Once again, you shouldn't get too caught up on the malware itself. You just need to know that there are specimens of malware that exist in the wild that can bypass many of the security endpoint security controls, and attackers can still scrape credit cards directly out of memory. Last question. How did Target first learn about this breach? Out of all the things we talked about today, this is probably one of the hardest truths about the Target attack. Unfortunately, in this situation, Target had to learn about this attack from the Department of Justice, from a third party. And as we mentioned, in many of the data breach reports that are out there today, unfortunately, the vast majority of organizations find out they were compromised, not through amazing security controls. Instead, they find out from third parties because the credit cards were being used for fraud, or we're seeing credit cards for sale on various black market websites. Hopefully, this is something that will get better over the next few years, but right now, we're continuing to see this trend moving forward. I wanted to say thank you very much for watching this video. My name is John Strand. You can follow me on Twitter and some of the ravings that I have out there. But I strongly hope that if you have any questions, if you need any clarification about what was covered in this video, or you just like to ask me general questions about attacker techniques, please do not hesitate to reach out to me, direct message, or @message me on Twitter. I'd be happy to help you out in any way possible. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you in another video again sometime soon.